really delighted to be chair today for this event, which is exploring the roles of higher education institutes and universities in the climate action agenda. My name's Natalie Day, and I'm Head of Policy and Strategy at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm co-chair of our Climate Action Steering Group at the university, so this is an agenda very close to my heart. And I'm also very involved in the Civic University Network, leading some of the policy work through the network. So we're really delighted to have such a great sort of turnaround audience today, and a great panel to discuss what is a really pressing agenda for universities. Certainly in the last few years or more, this agenda has become increasingly prominent, and rightly so, within our institutions. As anchor institutions in our regions and our places, we have a responsibility and an obligation in order to really be kind of civic leaders in the climate agenda. And often, as universities, we've found that we've sort of delegated that to our estates team. And whilst there's been fantastic progress, I think, on many of our campuses across the sector, there's also, importantly, been a real push to appreciate that we have a much wider responsibility. And we talk a lot, certainly at Sheffield Hallam and in other places, about the importance of a whole of institution approach to thinking about climate, whether that's in our teaching, in our procurement, in our research and innovation, but also in our civic and student engagement. So lots and lots of different stuff, lots of fantastic activities. And we're really pleased to have this session today to explore that more fully. This work today, I'm really pleased to be here today, particularly with Emily Morrison from the Institute of Community Studies, who we've been working with at the Civic University Network on a really important report in terms of exploring the role of place in these agendas, and also how we can support places and communities to transition to net zero. I flashed up a moment ago a slide of all of our speakers. We have a fantastic array of speakers today from a really diverse range of backgrounds, from within university sectors, from within local government and local politics, from within industry, and also within research and community sort of sector think tank organisations. So lots of different perspectives. Emily is going to talk us through a fantastic report that colleagues at the ICS have been working on the back of a series of events and roundtables that we've been coordinating on with the network over the past year, really exploring the role of higher education in climate, but through a place-based lens, and trying to think about the different elements of place and how that plays into different approaches to approaching the climate action agenda. So Emily's going to talk us through, she's going to give us a sneak preview really of a report that's due to come out hopefully today or the next day or so, which does reveal some of the findings of these various roundtables and events that have been happening across the UK, and looking at the different aspects and characteristics of place and how that plays into climate agendas. After Emily's gone through her presentation, she will then, there'll be an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion with her and some questions. So do keep the questions coming through the Q&A, and then we're going to throw to our fantastic panelists to give us some short reflections after that. But plenty of time for questions and answers. Please do ping them in the chat or the Q&A. Really looking forward to hearing from you and hearing your perspectives on this. But it's my great pleasure as chair to welcome Emily Morrison first to the podium to talk us through her report. So Emily Morrison from the Institute of Community Studies and a partner in the Civic University Network. Fantastic to have you, Emily. So look forward to hearing the sneak preview from you now.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and welcome everybody, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to share this preview with you. So we were really thrilled to work on this programme, partly because looking at how to support places and communities in the climate action agenda, and particularly how to work through the transition to what the UK government is calling net zero, has been a standing theme at the Institute for Community Studies since we did our communities agenda in 2019. And I think it's safe to say that whilst there is a huge amount of brilliant practice that's currently emerging, led from lots of different anchor institutions across the country, there's still a really underexplored kind of research area in terms of how you actually support places holistically in the transition to net zero, and also what the role of engagement with communities is as a part of that. So we were really thrilled when the Civic University Network and the UPP Foundation put this as one of their themes for year 2 of the work of the network. And just to introduce a few of the aims of the programme, if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Anna. So the aims of the programme were to explore how the civic agenda, so the work of HEIs in partnership with other local anchor institutions and with communities, could be a route to support the higher education sector to play a role in the climate action agenda. And I suppose what we mean by that is there's a lot of research already done. In some ways, you would say that higher education institutions have been leading the charge in terms of research and innovation, in terms of tackling decarbonisation, tackling all aspects of how different sectors and different parts of our economy and our society need to transition. But actually the civic agenda, because of its all-encompassing view on places, really provides a useful route, we felt, if we could test it, to see if it could support HEIs to think about the equally kind of whole institution and indeed a whole sector view to supporting places and communities in transition. We also wanted to understand how different universities have defined the challenge with or indeed for their particular local area, and also understand what HEIs are already doing, because a lot of this practice is not very visible, but we knew through the network already that there was a huge amount that was already going on that was led by universities with local places. And we also wanted to develop an emerging framework to support HEIs to prioritise and scale their work. And really that's about driving towards that whole institution and whole place approach that Natalie was talking about at the start. If we just move to the next slide. So just to set out a bit of the policy and sector context for this work. So really, there's a series of different strategies and indeed government policies that have come out really across the last kind of 2 to 3 years, led by different departments, and you can see a few on the screen there. The main one is really the intersection between the government's Build Back Greener strategy and the Levelling Up agenda. And many of you on the call will notice that there's a little bit of a tension between those documents. Indeed, how do you build back greener whilst also sort of levelling up? In other words, how do you reduce areas of activity to reduce carbon whilst also increasing areas of activity in order to level up? And there isn't an easy answer to that within those documents, but they are both challenges which the higher education sector and higher education institutions in particular were highlighted as key partners in the delivery of. But it's safe to say that perhaps the vision for that was maybe perhaps quite limited and was generally restricted towards the role that they could play within a green industrial revolution and the creation of jobs and also the reskilling of workers. But then also, how could you scale research and innovation to address really and tackle decarbonisation through technology and through innovation? And that really is quite a limited view of the role of HEIs in terms of the role they could play with places and communities. So we really wanted to expand on this view through this programme. We can move to the next slide. A brief picture of what we actually did. So this is the first stage of a wider programme of work, which will continue throughout the rest of the year to really gather some more intelligence and insight into this agenda. So we reviewed the policy and available literature to really start to kind of conceptualise the breadth of the contributions that HEIs could make. We clustered member institutions in the Civic University Network according to the commonplace challenges of the places they were sat in. So rather than just doing it according to institutions all within a particular region, you can see there were 4 main clusters there. So we clustered, for example, coastal universities sat within coastal communities and coastal economies, which have particular dependencies and particular challenges within net zero transition or within a move towards a more sustainable future for that place. And really the emphasis there was on cross-sector learning and really thinking about how can institutions learn from each other. And we wanted to test a theory that actually institutions would be working quite closely according to the type of places they were part of and not necessarily according to an institutional typology that might rank them. There were 4 roundtables which engaged over 60 institutions, and then we've done some analysis report, and there's a report which, as Nat says, will be available after this session, and recommendations. We can move to the next slide. So just to give you an idea of, and as Nat said, a bit of a teaser trailer of the report findings. So firstly, we asked how people were framing the local challenge for their institution with the local place that they are part of. And a set of distinctive place profiles did emerge within transition, and all of those so different types of place were framing the challenge very differently. So for some, it was about the transition from, mono employment structures and perhaps sort of mono economies through to a more diversified economy. For others, it was a challenge of connecting up quite rural and distant parts of their community with closer to the city in order to reduce kind of transport emissions and to think about how parts of the city could become more inclusive within a net zero context. For others, it was about biodiversity. So particularly for coastal institutions, it was thinking about how do we protect and preserve and indeed, re-energize the biodiversity of that place, and how do we make the most of natural resources within a green place agenda. So we found that there were distinctive place profiles which different HEIs were working towards in their vision for what the place transition would be to net zero. However, we also did find that HEIs engagement and the kind of practice they were leading was typically concentrated into one or two of the challenges within those places. So, for example, very concentrated on how could the university support the industries in that area to transition, or thinking about green curriculum models. There were very few institutions thinking from a whole institution and a whole place perspective at this point. There were very few local areas and institutions working under the concept of a just transition, which many of you will be familiar with. There was more use of this framing by Scottish and Welsh institutions, perhaps because the policies in those devolved nations are actually already using the term just transition, particularly in Scotland. And around 1/3 of HEIs do have sustainability and their civic leads working closely in partnership. And this was really seen as a strong model in terms of how the university could start to look outwards from the challenge of its reaching its own sustainability to the challenge of the place it was part of. If we can move to the next slide, please. So you'll see on the side of the screen, there's a few very common areas of practice. We found lots of practice, huge numbers of different, very innovative, very creative, really cutting edge initiatives, but we grouped and analysed them into quite a few common areas, and you can see those on the side of the screen there. Where that practice and the drive to respond to supporting places and communities came from for HEIs was quite often driven by their own research strengths and indeed, championed by individual academics, driven by campus or estate assets. So where there were campus universities, there were a lot of fantastic areas of practice of how they had sought to lead by example by making the campus very biodiverse, by putting green energy wind turbines onto campus where they had the space to do so, and how they had involved the local authorities and other local anchor institutions in meeting that challenge. There was a huge growth in local innovation partnerships, so people really seeing the green agenda as a new catalytic way to work locally around innovation. And then many were actually being driven by their own internal sustainability strategy. So those that were already championing and leading the university's own journey to become carbon neutral were also then being asked to lead on the place agenda as well. And there were some challenges around resourcing that were raised with that. Interestingly, many institutions who took part in the programme said that student demand and student-led initiatives were also a really key driver for pushing the institution to work closer with the local community on the climate action agenda. And I think that is something that we and UPP in particular have discussed is a really heartening finding, that it's very much being led by the student bodies that are coming up through the recruitment and pathway into university. And there were many exemplary case studies and initiatives that are featured in the report, which I think provide really useful examples of transferable practice. Next slide, please. In terms of coordination and gaps, there's obviously one of the key challenges is how to arrange kind of local governance, local working groups and coordination to mobilise all institutions towards a vision for local places in a greener future. We found that strategies for the university and indeed for other authorities were often hampered by a disconnect. So people did mention that it was very hard to set goals and to put measures in place and to track progress, because on occasion the university, the local authority, the combined authority, and then the national strategy were all operating to different time windows. So some working to 2030, some working to 2050, some working to 2035, and so forth. And how to negotiate and then to perhaps find common goals was very, very complex. There was a commonality in HEIs being part of local authority-led working groups, but a lot of work was described as being siloed within individual partnerships, and there was quite a lack of cross-place coordinated structures for pooling resources and really thinking about a coordinated strategy towards net zero. The EAUC scorecard, which I know that some of our speakers will talk about in a minute, was upheld as best practice for supporting HEIs, and that was referenced very, very frequently, and those who weren't already using it, I think, took away quite a lot from the usability of that from the sessions. And it was really highlighted that there was no cross-institutional forum at a strategic or a thematic level that was coordinating and driving good practice within the HE sector itself, and this was highlighted as a significant potential opportunity. Next slide, please. So we're now starting to look at what this may all add up to, and we've started to produce an emerging framework for place transition, and then to start to think about what the role of a university or universities could be in different place profiles within that. And this is very much the next stage of our programme, but we have got a draft framework which is part of the report that will be available, and really what we've realised that this is principally about as a programme is how far to track the alignments and gaps between institutions' sustainability and civic strategies, and how the vision that the civic university movement can provide can help institutions to think really expansively about the role they can play in transition to net zero. And the framework and our analysis of the practice that's already being done has kind of highlighted some significant gaps, which you can see on your screen, which is where perhaps there are a few standout models that we identified that are being led by universities in terms of practice, but there is a need for so much more, because they are really, really crucial to place and community transition to net zero. And you can see a few there on the bottom of the screen, particularly highlighting the need to perhaps map course provision against the future green local workforces was really highlighted as an area where there was a need for really exemplary practice, and a lot of people were really grappling with this challenge. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak to you. I don't want to take any more of the time that could be used for our fantastic panel and speakers, but thanks once again, and we hope you look forward to reading the report. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Emily, for a really comprehensive summary of the report, which, as Emily mentioned, will be released later on today. But a fantastic set of initial findings and a really helpful way of starting to frame the way and think about how different places are framing these sorts of things within their institutions. As I said, this is an opportunity now, if anyone's got any questions specifically for Emily on the report, please do pop them quickly in the Q&A before we move on to the panelists. I mean, I guess, you know, just to abuse my position as chair while I wait for questions to come through the system, I think the thing that's unique about the report is the fact that it does try to group institutions not based on their region, but on their similarities. You know, you talked about northern powerhouse ones or coastal institutions and or rural inland centres. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about this work, because often you might see, like, you know, a West Midlands or a Scotland or, you know, a Sussex or something. And I guess what are you sort of finding is you know, unique to each of the areas that perhaps we've not covered, we've not seen in other forums? You know, what was sort of distinctive about the northern powerhouse response versus the rural response? You know, can you give us some kind of sneak previews as to what was the different approaches, or perhaps one sort of significant thing that jumped out from the different roundtables?
Yes, absolutely. So I think one of the things that really struck me was that where there were higher education institutions that were often one of only a couple of institutions based in a more rural area, perhaps, that was really significant how far they had put biodiversity and the use of campus and the use of other space that they could acquire at the heart of the agenda, and they tended to be the institutions that were not just trying to meet net zero as a target, they were trying to go carbon negative, or they were really pushing the extent of the goals that could be reached for that local area. And it was really, really interesting to see how, quite often, I think universities based in large cities tend to get a huge amount of credit for how much work they're doing. But I think there's a real opportunity for institutions that sometimes perhaps get sort of slightly overlooked in this area, because they were really thinking beyond just reaching net zero, and they were actually really thinking all encompassingly about what's the future of the environment that we want, as well as around the social, economic and well-being aspects of transition for places and communities. And I think the only other thing I wanted to reflect on is we're going to be doing a bit of sense checking in the next stage as to actually whether another thing that was highlighted in the report was, in certain regions there is a real importance for institutions to work with each other who are in close proximity, just to share different strengths, because not all regions have lots and lots of multidisciplinary institutions. Some have specialist institutions, which means that when the local authority goes to that institution and says, can you help us with housing, or can you help us with this particular challenge, that institution is not necessarily equipped with research strengths or innovation strengths in that area, but they are in other areas. And if institutions can work together, they can pool research, resource and support, which then makes it easier for the local authority and for other actors trying to draw on research and innovation expertise, because they then almost get that kind of flow of knowledge in the round, rather than thinking, oh, we're a bit lost on the housing side of net zero because nobody can support us. So we're kind of thinking about what's the sort of typology of engagement at the next step that would really draw some of that opportunity out as well.
I mean, I think that points to some of the questions that are appearing in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. It always sounds so secretive, but and really about that typology, but how do we decide on the place types to group the universities, and also whether there's scope for universities to learn from each other across place types as well as within? So perhaps you might reflect on that, particularly as it relates to the next stage in this work.
Yes, of course. So we're running at the Institute for Community Studies a wider programme called Place and Community Transition to Net Zero. And so the place profiles were really driven from the background research and the data analysis about what kind of place, how would you group different places with common challenges around their economy, the extent of deprivation in their communities, or the extent of social and spatial inequalities that they're experiencing, the types of I suppose typologies of cities versus market towns, and the kind of, we also take into account the legacy of certain communities. And we couldn't do a perfect typology, because we would have had to have run sort of 8, 10, 15 different types of roundtables to be truly place sensitive, but we wanted to do a starter for 10. So that was driven from the cross analysis that's being done in that programme, but also drawing on other previous literatures that's considered kind of how different anchor institution to place relationships play out, which is probably very commonly known by the audience. And I think there is a huge amount of potential for cross-place learning. I think a lot of the institutions who took part in their clustered roundtables did want to keep engaging, just sort of saying it was really exciting to be in touch with a university in Scotland when they were based in a totally different area, and vice versa. But I think as we move through the programme, I do see benefit where there are thematic groupings, so where everyone is working on green curriculums, for example, getting all of those institutions into a room who have best practice models, and that may not reflect those place clusters. That's probably more about a thematic cluster in that sense. So it's a really good point, and I think we will be looking at how we do that in the next 2 stages of the programme.
Thanks, Emily. I think that points to, I think we're, as came up in the findings in the workshops, etc., there's a bit of an appetite here to share experience. I can see from a colleague up the road at the University of Sheffield in wanting to sort of understand and supporting each other and supporting HEIs in this journey towards net zero or climate action or just transition or whatever terminology your institution's using, and a real opportunity there to try and share expertise and approaches And that's certainly something I think we're keen to sort of explore, you know, the different types of forums that are useful in this space and how best to aid our collective development. And I think, as John Goddard has also put in the chat, there is quite a lot of potential in this space to more explicitly link the climate agenda to issues of levelling up, and sort of particularly in post-industrial towns, etc., and the challenges there. So really looking forward to the next stage of the report. I think there is just one more question before we move on to the other panelists, and that's about what sorts of disciplines did you look at, and what were the relationships, if any, that you could detect between sort of projects and certain funding streams, perhaps from UKRI and other research councils. So that kind of connection between I think the research agenda and climate action in locations.
So we haven't mapped the funding structures as yet. That will be part of the next part of the programme, is really looking at who is funding this work, what's the resource available, because it was really highlighted as indeed an area that isn't receiving as much investment as perhaps even, you know, sort of the policy areas to try and encourage HEIs to be sustainable in and of themselves as institutions, or indeed money that's just flowing into levelling up, you know, but with no particular green measures or, you know, green drivers behind it. And we're aware very much, because we are part of the civil society sector, of the absence perhaps of discussion of net zero transition within the levelling up funds. And I think it's something that the university sector has a real role in advocating for. So we haven't mapped the funding flows, but in terms of disciplines, I mean, it really could not have been more diverse, I think, is the really heartening point. I mean, one of the areas of practice I wanted to just highlight was some of the outstanding work being done by the arts-based institutions, who have been really, really critical to the community engagement aspect, and a lot of the best practice in how to actually bring the community on board with the notion of transition seemed evident from universities such as Goldsmiths and UEL and many others that were engaged in the programme. And I think sometimes people feel, oh, maybe the arts don't have as much a role to play as, you know, people working on energy or on hydrogen, or, you know, thinking about, you know, regeneration or housing, for example. But actually, I think all disciplines were seen to have a role to play. I think the challenge is how to connect up interdisciplinary forums that can really look at the challenge in the round for different places.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emily. And it was remiss of me to not, I mentioned Jonathan's thoughts from University of Sheffield around the sort of importance of these networks, but I didn't get to his question, which was about how you can sort of scale up these initiatives and these sorts of conversations. I wonder if you've got any quick reflections on that before we go to the panel.
I think in terms of scaling up, I think first and foremost, it's more about scaling across, I think. That's not to dodge the question, sorry, Jonathan. It's more just that I think there's a need perhaps to think about how do we connect resources across a place so that we're not duplicating effort and we're not encountering innovation and research wastage, where there's fantastic work being done, because there's research and innovation also being led by the business sector, you know, civil society sectors, and other, you know, anchors of places, and it's not being shared and necessarily connected. And as a result, the risk of kind of wastage in terms of both resource use, but also, you know, data and useful practice is quite high at the moment. So I think it's first about how do we connect across in order to pool resources, which will enable us to scale up, I think, in that regard. So I think we're probably one step kind of before the scaling, but I'm also wouldn't claim to be the expert on scaling innovation, for example. So I'd be really interested if others in the room have suggestions in how we might scale up.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Emily, and thanks to colleagues for all the feedback in the chat and the Q&A. It's really helpful in these sorts of events to have that kind of online chat as well as me and Emily talking. So it's now time to refer to our panelists. So as mentioned, we've got a really great set of speakers now to kind of respond to Emily, but also just to give their own reflections on the importance and the opportunities for HEIs in this space. And so the first up, the sort of batter up, the first one in the panel is Jason Clark. Really pleased to have Jason here. Jason is the head of energy and environment at UPP. So he leads all of their environmental sustainability strategies and policies and plans, and has worked with a huge number of institutions, research of higher education institutions and others, I think in the sort of corporate and external environment on this sort of journey. So Jason, really pleased to have you. So a couple of minutes of reflection from you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And I can keep this brief because Emily has articulated very well a lot of my thoughts on this, on the report. But I have a number of observations. It was interesting to see the ways in which the challenge was framed at the different institutions and how that was impacted by things such as the local geography, history and culture in those regions, and where there's a need to embed that if we are to bring about, truly place-based strategies to respond to a climate emergency. So that, I think, was one of the things which came out very strongly. But I was also taken by what appeared to be a more general framing of the role of universities within the challenge, which was primarily around the decarbonisation of buildings, their own buildings, and around upskilling and research. And there was less in the report about the unique position that universities have within a community and the capacity that universities have for, one, harnessing the thinking of its student body and that capacity for a greater local thought leadership that didn't come out as strongly as the other elements around decarbonisation and upskilling. And it was also interesting to me that I think the report identifies the various scales that universities are having to operate at. And the need for collaboration across those various scales. So internally within the institutions themselves, there appears to be a bit of I wouldn't say, well, it may be a lack of systemic sort of or holistic approaches to tackling these issues, where it's you have pockets of good practice or pockets of action around these issues. Either that's through the estates facilities teams driving around net zero, or in civic areas or academic research. But again, that need for collaboration at that scale isn't yet as joined up as it could be. And I think that's mirrored at across the HE sector, and it's also mirrored locally, where we don't seem to see as much of the collaboration that's really required to address this issue. And another thing that I really was very interested in that came out of the report was there was a focus around ESD, so Education for Sustainable Development, and I'd be really interested to see where a lot of the attendees and also panelists think that how ESD could be used either in a formal or informal way to address some of these co-working or focus groupy sort of activities or outreach or embedding activities that could be done, and whether ESD can be used as a catalyst to try and improve that sort of outreach and engagement within the local community. So they're my initial thoughts on it. I hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Jason. I'm just trying to get my video back. That's really helpful, and in terms of sort of capturing, I think, some of the areas that perhaps we could think about in the next stages of the work. I mean, I'm conscious about your reference to the absence of sort of local thought leadership, and I wonder if you might reflect on that, because do you think that's partly because some of the areas that a university might be involved in, they don't have overarching jurisdiction or responsibility for? So if you take active travel as an example, universities might be able to put in all the showers and the lockers and the so on for people to carry bikes and infrastructure and tax incentives, etc. But that is also very much bound up with the location, isn't it? And the transport routes and the bike paths and the sort of, and those things are really outside of a university's control. So do you think sometimes universities are reluctant to be too vocal in particular areas because they understand the limits of their jurisdiction? And I wonder, sort of building on that, if you might reflect on what you think are the barriers to collaboration? Why is it that we're not seeing the kinds of levels that you're hopeful in the sector?
Yeah, I would agree. Yes, there are limits for the university action, and particularly in those areas such as travel and so on. And I think what happens is that universities, like for example, when I was at City, University of London, one of the things that we looked at there was around creation of low traffic corridors or routes that students could use to get to and from their activities at the university, and trying to engage with the local authority to widen that out and make that available, those routes also available for local communities. And I think there is, I do believe that there is the appetite for institutions to do this, but it's the forums that universities often engage with local authorities on are more directly related to the point that I made, which is around decarbonisation of buildings and so on, which are more tangible. And obviously, I think there's this view, because obviously universities are often one of the major emitters within a local area, that's the focus, and that's where a lot of the work goes in. And I think there is more that could be done. I think there's more that could be done in terms of, as I said, this unique position that universities have for engage, or for harnessing the views of younger generations and sort of bringing that into discussion. And I think that's really what I'm trying to get at. It's not something that I think that universities are shying away from. It's the opportunity to be able to do that.
No, I completely understand. I completely understand that. And I do think universities are on a bit of a steep trajectory here. If I think about my own institutional experience, when we first started to think about all this, we framed it very much in terms of net zero. So it was all about sort of getting to net zero. And through the process, we renamed our work to be more around climate action, because we were accepting that that net zero was just one component, but ensuring that our students and our staff and our institution was much more carbon aware, climate aware, and much more aware of the sort of bigger challenge beyond sort of specific scopes 1, 2, and 3, that it was more appropriate framing. So that was a journey that we went on, and I'm sure that in a year or so from now, the conversation will become even more sophisticated, well, I hope, across institutions and the breadth of things that we can do. Fantastic. As I said, if there's any questions for any of the panelists as they pop up, please do pop that into the chat. But thank you, Jason, for your quick remarks. And we are going to have an opportunity to ask further questions of the panelists when we get to the broader Q&A at the end. But the next batter up on my lineup is Andy Nolan, Development and Sustainability Director at the University of Nottingham. He's also chair of the AUD's Sustainability Advisory Group and wears many hats. So, Andy, I think you've got a bit of a flashing light behind you, which leads to the atmosphere in many ways. But over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Natalie. And thanks for the opportunity to speak this morning. This is a subject that's really close to my heart and a really important part of what we do and what I get involved in with both AUD, so the Association of University Directors of Estates, but also my day job as Development and Sustainability Director at the University of Nottingham. And I'm also, and I have been involved for a very long time with the EAUC, and Matt will talk about the role of EAUC and EAUC's thoughts on this when he's on the panel. But yeah, there's a lot to like in this report, and I really recognise the findings and the kind of issues that have come out. What I really liked, and Jason alluded to it as well, is the way in which it's been framed around different geographies and the different issues that are around place, which I think brings a really interesting dimension that I don't think the sector's looked at in quite the same way before. It's worth reflecting a little bit on a couple of observations, really. I mean, firstly, I think the sector, higher education sector in the UK, has a track record of willingness to share best practice and information. Oddly, despite the fact that we are increasingly competitive, that's never diminished. And for 20 years with the AUC, and certainly in the 5 or 6 years that I've been representing AUD in various different ways, there's never a shortage of sharing best practice, and it happens daily. It doesn't happen quite the same way as with the geographies, even though regional groups are set up. you'll tend to get northwest, northeast, and of course within that you bundle up coastal, rural, and urban universities. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic, a way of looking at it, and I think that will maybe flush out a few things that we could do better and start to look at where the opportunities are. So what I really liked is, I mean, there's some really good recommendations in the report about taking a whole system and place-based approach. And of course, anyone that's kind of worked in the sustainability field will kind of recognize that as a really important part. I see this, there are loads of reasons why working through a civic partnership is the right thing to do. The conversation that Natalie was just having with Jason around dependencies is an interesting one. You know, the highways network, for example, and quite often it can be a reactive relationship where a university grows and a local authority says, right, we've got to do something about the car parking or the active travel or the public transport network because you're causing us a problem with your growth. And I think we've got to flip that round really, because universities are often seen as great contributors to the city that they're based in. They bring diversity, they bring different cultures, faiths, experiences. Of course, they bring money, they bring expectation, and they bring problems. And you know, there's a multitude of reasons as to why civic agreements are set up. In Nottingham, we have the Universities for Nottingham initiative, where the two universities and the city council work together, but that's evolved and become quite a powerful and effective civic agreement with multi-partners involved. And it's also worth saying that as a city in Nottingham, we've had a green partnership which both universities have sat on alongside major businesses and third sector groups, and they celebrate its 30th birthday since its inception next Monday. So things do have longevity, and we don't have to start from scratch on so many of these things. So there's other reasons why we should do things, and the issue about talking at scale, I think, is really key. Emily's point about sort of lateral rather than perhaps depth was really interesting, but I see these initiatives like a set of Russian dolls, and our campuses are big in many respects and already quite complex and challenging, but they do sit within a wider hierarchy of the suburb or the area of the city that you might be based in, the city as a whole, and then the regions or sub-region, and of course nationally and globally. And there are things that just are better delivered and more effective at those different range of scales, and picking that scale is going to be super key. So for me, those are some of the key sort of observations on the report. I think in terms of challenges, I think the report already acknowledges that there are multiple foci for this. People are looking at biodiversity and environmental quality, but carbon reduction and climate change seems to be a major driver. Engagement in all of this is going to be super important. So understanding the motivating factors for both the local authority and the university will be important. You know, why do we want to get involved? If we get that right and we define that well, it will sustain, I'm sure. But it's not to diminish the complexity that universities themselves have. And the report acknowledges actually it's very difficult to build, sometimes for externals, to build relationships internally. And so we've addressed that in Nottingham, and I really like some of the recommendations and observations in the report about how you create this kind of civic gateway, if you like, where the right leaders come together to talk about those things. And I think it's something about why universities. Well, you know, universities have a beautiful sort of situation, really. They're independent, they're not politically driven, at least not in the same way as a local authority is. So they can provide a sort of independent arbitrator, facilitator, and convening role, which I think is super important. And they have big impacts themselves. I mean, Nottingham's population of students is about 20% of the city population. So it's, you know, we've got a responsibility to do this stuff. And then I'm going to just close on a couple of thoughts, really. For a long time, universities have been talking about campus, community, and curricula. So what we do on our campus to tackle climate change, So the operational things like transport and energy use and building carbon reduction programs into how we operate, that's traditionally where we've been, and that's where I think ORD and EAUC have done a lot of work. But there's always been a factor around community, but it has been weak. It could be a lot stronger, more effective and better governance. So I think how we find ways of firming up some of that community stuff is really important. Interestingly, I think the hardest bit to change is the curricula. And you know, there are always good intentions and good ideas at a local level about what a city economy might need, but changing curricula is like pulling teeth, really. It's not an easy thing to do. There are so many barriers in the way in which the governance around education and learning is set up. But there are some really exciting things going around knowledge exchange, and many universities have really active programs in this area. Indeed, we do at Nottingham. So I would urge, you know, that we need to unlock some of that stuff. Sadly, the DFE recent report and strategy around sustainability was incredibly weak in terms of higher education. And we should continue to pressure DFE on all of that to make it clearer and easier for us to affect change. So I'm going to stop there, Natalie, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great, Andy. Thanks a lot. Lots of really interesting reflections there from Russian dolls and university beautiful positions, etc. So thanks very much for those thoughts. There's a good question from John Goddard in the chat there about just, you know, as this becomes ever increasingly important within institutions and within sort of things like civic university agreements, about how we can practically measure the impact of climate action in relation to things that, you know, where universities are accountable for place. So, you know, how do we, given, you know, the whole range of players and factors involved in some of these initiatives, you know, what sorts of impacts and measurement metrics are meaningful, and over what sorts of timeframes? And particularly when you're thinking about it in terms of teaching and research, which are often placed behind.
Yeah, so interestingly, the University of Nottingham, we had a really interesting dialogue with the City of Nottingham. Nottingham is amongst, it's held up as one of the local authorities that's leading the way around active carbon reduction, and they're doing a huge amount. Set a very politically driven carbon reduction target to be carbon neutral by 2028. Incredibly, you know, demanding and challenging target. The university, when drafting its strategy, took on board and made a commitment to supporting the city's target around carbon reduction. So we worded that very carefully, because we hadn't at that point set our own carbon reduction targets. But our ambition to support the city was made really clear in 2019. And the metrics that are around that are reported into the Civic Agreement and into a wider sort of performance framework for the city. It's way more challenging around teaching and research, of course, and there are 2 universities in Nottingham that would need to have a common set of metrics that report those things in. It can be done, but I think we're still at the very early stages of sort of pulling that data together. I think this is my point about the different motivations. Actually, the city is determined to drive down its scope 1 and 2 emissions and to work harder on scope 3. It's probably less interested in the global research and the kind of ref papers and research activity that we've had in some of the areas of expertise we've got.
No, I think that's right. I mean, really interested in your comment on curriculum, and interested if colleagues in the chat or Q&A want to sort of share reflections on their own experience in terms of embedding climate into the curriculum. I think has been highlighted in the report and in other places, as students increasingly expect institutions to have more prominent climate components in their courses and on their campuses, then that will help in the sort of shift to switch curriculum. I mean, I think the other real opportunity, certainly again from our own institutional experience, is trying to not do this as a sort of separate process, but embedding it in existing curriculum structures and processes and review structures to enable climate to be embedded that way. And then also in terms of climate awareness within department leads, course leads, etc., to empower colleagues. But as you say, it's a really tricky one, isn't it, to try and figure out how best to do that. So, really interested in any reflections on,
Yeah, I'll give a quick reflection, because I think often it's not always well known at a corporate level just how much you're doing around this. So curriculum reviews often tease out that you're doing more around this than you realise. It's often demand-led, so it will be changes to course material and delivery will be led by response from students, but it will also be from professional bodies. If you're working in civil engineering, if you're in architecture, chemistry, things like that tend to drive those curricula forward much faster than perhaps subjects where sustainability could be very easily integrated into the curricula, but perhaps there isn't that same professional standards that are required. I think there's a huge amount of bureaucracy around how you change teaching programs and modules, both internally and externally. And my personal view is that some stronger leadership from government on this would make a huge amount of difference, both locally and nationally. And there's a formal and an informal curricula that students will fall into. You get a lot of students in your university that are very interested and motivated by sustainability issues, but they might be studying something for which is difficult to kind of embed it. But there's no lack of enthusiasm or desire to kind of push forward. And I've seen that in the 4 universities I've worked at, all of which have been kind of Midlands Engine or Northern Powerhouse institutions. One day I might work on the coast, you never know.
Well, if anyone likes to, approach Andy after the event with a job opportunity on the coast, please do so. Thank you, Andy, for that. I think we've got lots of good questions coming through, and I think we'll probably come back to sort of staff training and awareness and curriculum in the broader Q&A at the end. But we might just keep moving through our panelists before we get to that point. So I think we're now going to draw up Matthew Woodthorpe from the Alliance of Sustainability Leadership in Education. And I think this is very timely to bring Matthew up as a speaker. He's the Scotland Programme Manager, but certainly from, again, from our institution, the toolkit and the scorecard and the work that your institution has done in really helping to lead some of the framing devices and the conversations in this space has been fantastic. So great to have you, Matthew, to share your perspectives and ideas in this space. So over to you.
Thank you, Nassal. Yeah, it's great to join today. And just as a quick reflection on the report, I feel like it's a really timely piece. It doesn't reinvent the wheel with regards to how higher education institutions really play civic roles, but it does provide a really crucial snapshot as well as insights into the landscape of higher education institution action and civic action as it stands today with regards to climate change responses. And I think that's really key. It's been touched on in the reports around AUC's and ORD's Sustainability Leadership Scorecard. And I think one of the great thing about that is it's the reflection points. We're often so busy doing all this great action, we don't stop and take stock. So I really appreciate this report coming out. And I've made a note here, looking at the emerging framework for place transition and then EAC Scotland's work, I'm definitely going to be looking at how we can integrate that into our programme, work with Scottish Funding Council on that as well. I just want to pull out a few things at this stage, which I thought was quite interesting from the report. The first one I want to touch on it's just a sentence, but it acknowledges the wordings around the moonshot and research and innovation, and recognising we don't have the funding or economy landscape to do another moonshot, essentially. And that's disappointing for some people who call for such a thing. But equally, if we look at other research, so the Committee on Climate Change report a couple of years back, highlights we don't necessarily need that. In order for the UK to get to net zero, it summed up generally that 1/3 of the emissions reduction will come from technology and innovation, 1/3 will come from behaviour change only, and 1/3 of that will come from a blend of the two, of behaviour and technology. So I think, naturally within higher education institutions, we focus a lot on research and innovation because that's such a hive of activity. It's often sometimes to the detriment of acknowledging actually this wider role institutions can play around community engagement, around teaching skills and knowledge to its student body as well. And I think it lends into a couple of things. So Emily was talking about the arts, for example, and something I've noted down from the report is that actually we have to recognize not every institution needs to be a leader at everything within the climate actions field. Some places will not have climate research happening or an education environmental program happening. But if it has an arts program, how can we engage with our local community in a really meaningful and emotive way? Because that is so powerful. So, can we change it a little bit and say, actually, irrespective of where you are, as long as you're making a concerted effort to tackle climate change in your institution as a community, then fantastic. But it's got to be concerted. I'd stress that. Touching on something that Jason talked about, ESD and upskilling as well, that role around that 1/3 of behavior change and that blend, it's great to see institutional action around reskilling. We need to develop the capacity to deliver technology that's already available. That's a big thing, is it's not necessarily about new technology, it's about disseminating what we've got. So there's great programs. For example, there's a program big going at the moment called Talented Islands Project. So that's working at Orkney and Shetland to support their net zero journey, and that's got Heriot Wart, Robert Gold University and University of Highlands Islands involved alongside local authorities, look at how we can get green skills into the local economy. So just doing that wider social, economic benefits as well as the environmental. Some work EAUC Scotland had done previously around COI16, so that's Conference of Youth, that leads up into COP26. I really acknowledge that, at the moment in the UK, there's over 5 million students in colleges and universities. So that represents 7% of the UK population. It's 12% of the UK's economically active population. So if we're able to get green knowledge, green skills, understanding of climate change on the SDGs, that's phenomenal when it comes into the workplace. There's such scope for change there that I think is still a bit underutilized. It's great how much institutions have taken on with the SDGs, but we can do more there. And I think there was also a moral imperative, and that came through in our COI16 statement. We have to acknowledge that a student who's 18 starting college or university today, in 60 years is going to experience probably a heat wave every other year in the UK based on Met Office data. So there's a moral imperative to equip them with the skills and knowledge to understand the world that they're going to be facing and to hopefully be more resilient in it as well. A second point I really want to touch on is around adaptation. So that came up a couple of times in the report, which is good to see. And I mean adaptation both in terms of internal responses in the institution and its states, but also in a place-based sense as well. I feel like adaptation could really be a really useful vehicle for wider partnerships, so linking up with other public bodies in a region. And as an example, there are a really good local project in Scotland. There's the Climate Ready Clyde project, so looking at the greater Glasgow area. And there's 15 partners on that, 2 higher education institutions alongside NHS, local authorities, for example. And they've been sharing the resource, so acknowledging, we can all do consultancy projects to pay a lot of money to get that adaptation analysis internally, but if we pull our resources together, we get it's cheaper and we get a regional viewpoint as well. But this is a launching pad for, once you've got that relationship going, that's a launch pad for other things. So as you're talking about adaptation, you can bring up other issues around active travel, sustainable travel, for example, as well. It's an opportunity to build partnerships. But on adaptation as well, something we're finding in Scottish sense is that whilst institutions are producing this great knowledge, sometimes not actually using it internally as well. So if we're looking at in Scotland, we have to report climate data every year to Scottish Government. And the higher education and further education sector is actually the least, it's the furthest behind in terms of their climate adaptation and risk assessment compared to all the other public bodies in Scotland, which is really surprising considering we create a lot of the data that other institutions, other public bodies are using. So maybe there's something there that we have to better link up internally as well to progress this agenda. As a final point as well, I just want to touch on, there's the report highlighted 2 aspects of, internal climate action, reducing, climate emissions and mitigation operations, and then that community aspect on the other side and wider engagement. But there is that element of overlapping as well in certain projects. So something that's starting to build in Scotland with some funding from Scottish Government is, for example, around heat networks. These are going to be so crucial for a lot of institutions, also businesses, other public bodies, in getting decarbonised heat in future, so reducing their Scope 1 emissions. But we often can't do it on an individual basis. So we need institutions to work together with local authorities to set the groundwork to show, actually, we've got some money, we need your help to get this off the ground. And if you get enough of those organisations coming to the table, then recognise, actually, we can bring in private investment into these systems. And that's what's needed. I think it's been really useful. The Scottish Government's really been beating the drum that there's £13 billion of public sector procurement spend in Scotland. How can we better utilise it, not just for ourselves, but also to leverage private investment as well? So I'll leave it there for a second, but I think, again, just fantastic report, and I think really timely and lots of lessons for us at EAUC to take forward.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great, and a whole range of things that you covered there in terms of the possibility of universities. And I've definitely been on a learning curve in the last year, learning about heat networks, which I can honestly say I knew nothing about a year ago, and now I find myself talking about them at dinner parties, which is kind of quite bizarre and scary. But I mean, again, Q&A, put things in the Q&A, folks, if you've got any specific questions for Matthew based on the range of things he covered there. I think I wanted to pick up on the curriculum point again, Matthew, that you covered in your address, and just to sort of ask if you had any sort of reflections on what is kind of best practice in this space in terms of, is it in trying to embed it in existing kind of curriculum courses, or trying to do more bespoke, sort of separate, come over here and do your climate ready or your carbon literacy training as a sort of separate standalone module, and whether whether you make them compulsory. And I think these are some of the things that universities are grappling with. This is that you can often have the higher aim of trying to help students be climate aware, but then naturally courses are constrained in how many modules, and you get into all sorts of issues of credit, etc. But I'm not sure we've really cracked yet what is the best way to do this, and also the way that responds most appropriately to what students want.
I think it's a great question, and sadly I don't know if it's a difficult answer, because I think that is a challenge in Scotland. The exact same questions are happening, but I think the great thing is that those discussions are happening, and they're happening more often. EAC Scotland is partnering with some institutions and Learning Sustainability Scotland at the moment on a QAA funded piece of work around how do you monitor and evaluate ESD within the curriculum. So looking at different frameworks and producing tools for institutions to use. So hopefully that's another bit of asset to further, when we're looking at that question, actually, what is the impact of the different actions we're taking? It might be that an institution goes down the direction of saying, actually, we're going to do a standalone module, and it comes back around later on. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But I think, again, it goes back to that. We've just got to make a concerted effort. We do need to make a change, and we're not going to get it right straight away. We rarely do with that. But this is a journey, definitely. And I think just touching, because I think Annie made a great point around student demand in this space as well, and just touched on that. And I think a challenge maybe for institutions to put out there is that how can we better equip our student unions around their understanding of ESD in this space. Previous to I did work in a students' union, but we've got the QAA ESD guidance that came out recently. How are we supporting our VP educations, our course reps, our faculty reps to understand and interpret that best guidance? Can they take that to lecturers? Because I think that'd be a really powerful tool. But I think at the moment, a lot of students struggle to understand what is actually possible, that realm of possibility. So they don't say something, or they're not quite sure how to say it in as a strategic or impactful way. So I think that's a challenge to institutions to better engage with the student networks.
Thanks, Matthew. And I think you're right. And there was a question also in the Q&A about the role of student unions. So thank you for picking it up. And and another useful model is thinking about sort of climate champions from the student body that attend curriculum boards and teaching and learning boards, etc., to try and as you say, increase the sort of student voice in these sorts of debates about how best to progress them. So thank you very much to Matthew. I'm just going to move now to our final panelists, and then we're going to get all the panelists together on one screen. But we're really delighted as our final panelists to have Emily O'Brien with us. Emily is the Green Party councillor for the Cooperative Alliance-led Lewis District Council down in Sussex. So fantastic to have Emily with us today. She's obviously very passionate and knowledgeable about sort of green planning agendas, and around issues of sustainability, biodiversity, etc., and comes at this, we're really interested in your perspectives, Emily, as somebody that's not sitting directly within a higher education institute, about what we can and should be doing in this space, particularly through that place-based lens. So, Emily, over to you.
Thanks ever so much, Natalie. Really good to be here. Like others, really welcome the report, and you'll be glad to know that as the representative of civic society, as you university people like to call everyone else, I'm totally agree with most of what's there, with one area of disagreement, which I'll come on to. So a couple of reflections then. Firstly, I think I really welcome the approach around leadership. It made me think about our kind of a journey really towards climate emergencies, which have been declared across so many institutions, so many universities and councils now. I don't know if everyone actually knows the story about where the first climate emergency declaration came from, but it was actually a Green Party councillor in Bristol Council, Carla Denyer, who did it for her council. And then it was such a galvanising force for bringing that sense of urgency and leadership. It spread quite quickly, initially amongst other green councillors like myself, but very quickly mainstream. And it's now something that, a majority of councils have done, and indeed many other institutions, like I think the majority of your universities as well. And I think that's a really important story around kind of leadership and change, really, that actually, how do you bring leadership? What does that tool look like? But also, I think the other side of it, as others, I've really welcomed the emphasis on partnership within the report. We've declared a climate emergency. That isn't something we can fix on our own. Part of leadership is about convening power, as others have said, bringing people together, working in partnership to address the issues. And I think, obviously, I'm here as a representative of the local government association. So we pretty much do at the LGA, I think, what your role as a network does, which is about bringing people together to share good practice and learning, as well as being a collective voice to government. I think, that kind of important kind of convening role comes through that as well. Again, the LGA, in partnership with UCL, runs a net zero innovation programme, which provides funding to develop local partnerships between councils and universities to deliver local carbon mitigation, as well as biodiversity and adaptation goals as well. And I can put a link to that in the chat, because there's some really interesting examples of collaboration I think are really important in terms of seeing both that leadership and that partnership. I think the other thing that's totally welcomed in the report, as others have said, is around taking a place-based approach. Everywhere is different. We're all trying to solve a climate emergency. It looks different in every one of our places. We have a different makeup, different geographies, different skills, different challenges. And one of the roles that universities are so important for is around helping us to have the evidence to make the right decisions locally. And in my own council, in Lewis District Council, we've worked with, we've kind of had a programme where we've worked with, brought together 7 councils in total to look at collectively decarbonising our housing stock. And to do that, that's a really important role that as councils we can play. We can't do everything, but certainly we own a huge amount of housing stock between us across the country. Councils own a lot of housing. And we spend a lot of money maintaining it. And in fact, just across those 7 councils who are all in Sussex, and not all of Sussex, just part of Sussex, we collectively will be spending £1 billion between now and 2030 on maintaining that housing stock. So it's really important that we're looking at how we channel that maintenance budget, which does exist. It's not extra money from government. It's what we'd be spending on the upkeep and the renewal of our council, not even rebuilding. We have a separate budget for that, but the renewal of existing stock, that we are channeling that to retrofit. And the university's played such an important role in that, because our local university has done the analysis on actually what works, what does it cost, so that we can make some really clever decisions about the trade-off between different retrofit solutions. Some of them are hugely expensive. How well do they work versus things that cost a bit less So we've got all the, we're having to make those complicated decisions around the trade-off between cost and carbon and inconvenience, and they have absolutely done amazing research to inform that. So it's a genuinely evidence-led approach. I did say there was an area of disagreement. I would completely disagree with you, Emily, although we have the best names. I would say that the levelling up agenda is exactly the same agenda as the move to be carbon neutral, to be zero carbon. And as an LGA asked, not just myself as a Green Council, but the LGA, we're really championing the role of building back greener as the route to a better future economically, as well as and in terms of achieving the government's aims around levelling up. Basically, the new jobs that we need in those levelling up areas, which we all have. It's not that it's a north-south thing. As someone in the south, I know how important the disparities within our areas, how much more important they are than the disparities geographically. But in order to take action on that, we do need those new green jobs. That's where we need to channel the spend. And that's not just me as a Green Council, that's a really important LGA ask. And the other reason we need that is, as was acknowledged at the beginning, is we're doing this work against a huge cost of living crisis. And we can't address that without looking at those things, particularly things like warmer, well-insulated housing, which is an upstream solution to reducing people's energy bills. That's such an important part of that agenda. So I would argue really strongly those are the same, that there isn't a tension between them, that we have to do the building back greener in order to achieve levelling up. I've been given the time limit, so I'm just going to say one really quick reflection. I think when we talk about place-based, as I said, what's really important is that there's differences between places, and it's really important to recognise the kind of those variances and the different solutions. So there's two things, isn't it? One is understanding the differences, which is where our university partners can help us. The other thing is sharing, which we're doing through this network and which we at the Local Government Association have a programme of doing. But it's also really important we think about the scope. So often, climate and energy, transport and energy feature in climate action. And actually there's things like the food economy are so important in those more rural and coastal areas, which I was really keen to hear, pleased to hear Emily mention earlier. So the board I sit on for the Local Government Association, the People and Places Board, has a rural and coastal focus. It's the non-metropolitan areas. And it's really important we don't see city solutions as the solutions. I should declare an interest. I work for a national food charity, Food Matters. I work on, in my day job, not as a councillor, but I work on the Sustainable Food Places programme, which is about taking partnership, place-based approaches to food, including food and climate change. And I just know how important it is that we think about our green jobs of the future as also being in the agricultural and rural sectors. I think there's 1 in 8 jobs are in the food economy if you go from kind of farm to fork, including hospitality and retail, and it's between 1/4 and 1/3 of all of our carbon footprints. So if we don't see them as part of the agenda, then we're missing a trick. So I also, the final thing I would really welcome is the mention that we move beyond cities, that it's not just about cities, it's rural and coastal as well. Thanks, Natalie.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emily. And always good to have a bit of hearty disagreement. And not that I'm suggesting we'll get to that today, but good to have some challenge and challenging responses to the different themes that have come out today that we can discuss in the Q&As. I think just quickly, I was sort of interested in your remark about how universities see everybody else as sort of civic, and I think that sort of touched on something that is ultimately at the heart of the Civic University agenda, which is about how we as institutions become a much more accessible and place-based in our focus, and how we can sort of break down silos and barriers or perceived barriers to our institutions, because as you say, we have a huge amount of expertise and contribution that we could make. But I wonder, just in your role as local council, whether you might reflect on how universities can become better at being a more open and engageable partner. I guess, how can we become more accessible and really sort of try and break down that perception that we are kind of these, esteemed institutions that set back and we're quite difficult to access. Because I think, that kind of is really key, and keen to sort of know how we can do it better, perhaps from your perspective.
There is no silver bullet, is there? I mean, I think the main thing is the agenda that you're setting out in this report and in these sessions, which is around really good engagement and listening. You know, I think when I was speaking to one of the officers, council officers, about this kind of, you know, major retrofit program, I said, you know, so what do you really welcome? He says, it's the fact the university has come down out of their ivory tower, that they were willing to listen to what the needs were on the ground and design a program around that. And to me, that's real leadership, isn't it? Sometimes we have to be humble and share the kind of, you know, the desire for it's not, leadership can be about a shared agenda. It's not just about being in front, I think is what I'd say. And I think also from the point of view, I'd actually answer this perhaps slightly more in my professional life rather than as a councillor, because as someone who's worked on, I think, the UK's leading food partnership for a number of years, one of the things I found in developing really good relationships with our local universities was that we felt we were often approached very late in the day on things. So we were approached because we were seen as an exemplar. We were asked to be a research topic. We'd really like to study how you've done this. We'd like you to be a subject for research. And what we actually needed was to be approached much earlier and co-design the research project, so that it met, you know, generally we had to say no to those. We just didn't have the capacity to do that. What we did need to know, though, were certain really important bits of evidence and data. And we did have some really successful projects working with universities to understand, individual students as well, to understand the stuff we needed to know in order to make real change happen.
Thanks, Emily. That's absolutely right. And I think there's a number of colleagues on the call here that are in knowledge exchange type roles within university. Again, a relatively recent phenomenon within our structures, but really important in terms of that two-way knowledge exchange. I'm going to suggest that we go to the full panel now and enable us to try and you know, take questions from throughout. So Juana, are you moving us to a full panel? And while we're setting up the full panel, I thought it might be good for Emily Morrison just to come back, I think, specifically on that sort of that thought about the connection between this agenda and levelling up as a sort of starting point. But do ping your Q&As into the chat boxes or the Q&A box, and we'll do a sort of round of questions. But Emily Morrison, over to you.
Thank you. And I mean, I always love a good challenge and a good disagreement. And I think the way that Emily O'Brien has put it in terms of the building back greener, I don't disagree with at all. I think where I have a reflection is, I think that, I mean, Andy Haldane himself, you know, he's one of the authors of the Levelling Up white paper, said that he felt that had he had his time again, he would have put net zero at the heart of it and the green agenda right, cutting through the paper. And I feel that my critique is more, it's partly the absence of the sense of needing to bring public, place and community with you from the start on this journey, that really the Levelling Up paper did not go far enough in suggesting, either in terms of how would local places and communities like to envisage their, you know, places changing in order to become more socially and spatially equal. You know, there is it sort of talks loosely about, you know, aspects that we would call devolution, but it really doesn't go far enough in terms of seeking to really redistribute resources and power into places and communities in order to achieve that. And I feel I felt it was more of a missed opportunity, I suppose, in terms of really wanting to go further and to be more radical, I think, in terms of how Levelling Up could have been the vehicle to achieve both. Because I do feel that the paper is very, very, you know, sort of narrowly constrained, I suppose, towards, you know, a certain number of you know, very important issues in terms of addressing spatial and social inequalities. And I think perhaps a bit light on some of the more kind of bottom up and grassroots aspects of the kind of empowerment needed to achieve net zero equitably. So my critique kind of comes more from that perspective, not that I feel the focus on green jobs is wrong in any shape or form. I would just like to see that question of which type of jobs do we want being put to communities, because we did a study last year of 40 years of similar policies to level up areas, even though they hadn't come under that brand name before. And really what we found was that those that had had very limited community involvement in setting those policies and those strategies within places, whether that was around bringing in of a new kind of employment sector or a new form of industry, such as is exactly what we have to do in net zero, we found that the ones that had very limited community involvement and very limited local power were the ones that were first to fall on their face, basically, and had achieved the least impact on spatial inequalities. And as such, I'm just, I suppose, nervous that that lessons haven't been learned from the failures of policies that have sought to do the kind of things that both Levelling Up and Net Zero are trying to do. And I suppose that's my nervousness around it not being writ larger in the Levelling Up white paper itself. But of course, the Build Back Greener strategy has it at the heart because it is the government's core strategy. So very, very nuanced. I'd love to continue the debate actually with Emily, because I think it is really interesting in terms of how far the two agendas are also working, connected or not, at local level and indeed behind the scenes of government. And that's probably a conversation for another time. But I think it is a really interesting question, basically, about which is getting more energy and, indeed resource at a funding level, and how do we connect those resources explicitly where they're not explicitly connected in policy? How can we do that at local and regional level, as it isn't necessarily being done at the national?
Great. I'm conscious
I'm
that
back on that, Natalie, just to say I do totally agree with Emily. Massive wasted opportunity that climate action wasn't at the heart of the Levelling Up white paper. Completely agree on that. I suppose the answer that we have here is that we take local action to do that. So just to say we don't really disagree, completely agree with you.
I'm just amused that you both seem to be proposing we add maybe another 100 pages or more to the Levelling Up white paper to make it a really, really thick, long, much longer report, given it's already about 400 pages. I'm conscious that we don't have huge amounts of time left, but we have been doing sort of Q&A as we go. So, we've been rolling as we go with some of the Q&As, but I just wanted to kind of ask the panelists maybe in the last few minutes if they had just sort of drawing on the various conversations and perspectives today about what they sort of think is the kind of one really critical mission or vision that institutions need to have if they're going to be really effective in terms of place-based climate action. What's the sort of one thing that institutions really need to have in their armory if we're going to make or drive change in this space? And so I'm going to go with you, Matthew, to start, just as putting you on the spot.
That's absolutely, really good question. The first thing that I'm leading to is in my head is just setting a strategy that isn't, or a policy context even from government, that doesn't derail institutions when there's staff changes at the top. So I think that is so crucial. We've got a case of a college in Scotland at the moment who's got some great work looking at doing a project on their estates, but there's a change of principle coming, so they have to pause it. But that means they'll be missing this funding round. They have to take that hit. So I think if there's in a Scottish government sense, we've got that public bodies, mandatory public bodies reporting, it creates such a strong steer for institutions saying, irrespective of the landscape and the changes, you have to deliver this. It's not just going to be this next few years, it's going to be up until 2045 or earlier. The same with if you've got institutional strategies saying we commit to work with our local communities. It doesn't have to lay out in actions, but just that commitment, these things will evolve. But I think it's something we can point to, staff can see there and they can align with. I think that is crucial.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. So that's around embedding sort of leadership and consistency in approach. Jason, over to you.
Yeah, there's one thing that I wanted to bring up earlier on, and it's something that also Matthew spoke about outside of this, which is about the ability to, with universities reskilling or upskilling and making sure that those skills are utilized within a particular place, which can be problematic for universities with the internationalization of universities and the fact that those skills often go outside of the community. So one thing that I think Matthew mentioned previously was around potentially working more closely with FE, where you're more likely to get those skills staying within a community as opposed to HE. So that partnership approach with further education is something which I think we need to look more closely at.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jason. That was great. Andy, do you want to give us your quick takeaway message?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a really great piece of work that used to happen, I'm not sure if it still does, in Sheffield, where the University of Sheffield would produce a State of Sheffield annual report, and it would hold a mirror up to the city in a very unequivocal, direct way. It would force the local authority to acknowledge where there were problems around attainment or air quality or carbon reduction or housing quality. And I think there's a really important role for universities to play in that, for being that independent playback, holding up the mirror. I've responded to John's question in the Q&A, but I think there is something about putting in place those frameworks. All of that only works if you've got a strong, trusting relationship in your civic agreement. Nobody wants to be held accountable for something they can't control. So it's about having the ability to influence, and that requires a maturity of those relationships that is beginning to, I think, bed in some places, or is bedded in, but there's still a long way to go.
Thanks, Andy. I'm pleased to hear Sheffield leading the way there. Emily O'Brien, do you want to go next with your one item?
Yeah, I think just similar to Andy's point, really, I think I would acknowledge the importance of leadership, but that leadership isn't about running in front. It's about the convening power, about bringing people together, about working in partnership. And to underpin that, the role of relationships is so important. So actually developing those relationships is such a key part of making really successful joint approaches and joint action. And we can't do it on our own, can we? None of us can do this without the other.
Thanks, Emily. That's a really important call to arms there. And other Emily Morrison, for the final 1 point.
I think one of the things that I was most heartened by, and I know Jason touched on this in particular, was the strength of the students' engagement in this initiative. And I think there's a huge amount of work being done by individual universities. There's a lot of student innovation challenges. There's a lot of Green Champions networks. And it would be fantastic if there was a way that this could be, become a real movement, basically, that it doesn't get kind of lost in individual institutions, and that we think about how it's a route to empower students from undergraduate through to postgraduate, because I think there's an opportunity to really re-envisage, the student civic experience as well, and think about how green can be a fantastic route also to engage students in other issues in their local communities, because so many, as we know from many people's data, are so passionate about the green agenda, but perhaps they might also then start to think about how they can contribute to other less, how should we say, topical or trendy agendas as well, which I think is always needed, in terms of that kind of students as volunteers and students as civic actors as well. So thank you.
Brilliant. I'm conscious that we have 1 minute to go in this event. So it's a fantastic set of final thoughts there around embedding leadership, around evidence and impact in terms of the important role we can play in climate action, but also around relationships and students. So it's absolutely been a fantastic morning of discussion. A huge thanks to all of our speakers, to the two Emilys, to Andy, to Jason, to Matthew, for some really provocative and thoughtful discussion. As mentioned, we will be releasing the report later today, so you'll be able to, finally get your hands on this thing that we've been talking about all morning. There is a feedback poll on the screen for the savvy viewers. Please do fill that in. We really appreciate your feedback, and do keep engaged with us as the Civic University in this agenda. It's a really important area that we're very passionate about, and we're really keen to hear from you about what sorts of things that we can and should be doing to support you. And as Emily mentioned, this report is the sort of start of a process, and there will be further work in this area around the sort of place-based lens through which we can think about climate. So as chair, finally, thank you all for joining. Please do fill in the poll. Please do come back and join us for watching this event and other events that are now available online. Thanks again to all our panelists. And this is our final event in what has been a week of activities for the Civic University for the network. And so thanks to all of you that have come to this and other events on the range of topics that we've covered this week. And I hope everybody gets to enjoy some of the sunshine today after a really fantastic morning of discussion. So thanks to colleagues for joining, and thanks to everyone in the Civic University Network behind the scenes that's helped make this happen. So have a great day.